Do you remember Fran Fine? The nanny who talked like a machine gun, dressed like she stepped off a runway, and the moment she walked in, the entire wealthy household fell out of rhythm, just to keep up with her laughter. People got used to seeing Fran Drescher as a joyful storm of the 90s. And because of that, almost no one was prepared for the truth. Behind that sound logo voice was a life that had been shattered in ways no sitcom would ever dare to write. A marriage that began when she was just 15, lasted through so many years, yet hid a secret so devastating it forced every memory to be rewritten. And beyond that, even her sense of safety was stolen inside her own home, leaving behind a trail of trauma that clung like a shadow, refusing to fade. And when she still hadn't fully understood how she even survived, her body began sending strange signals, a medical battle that stayed blurry, dragged on for years, until the name of it finally emerged like a verdict. Yet she did not turn tragedy into a full stop. She kept the very voice people once mocked. She kept the identity others demanded she fix. And then she transformed her wounds into power, on screen and in real life. From the moment people realized that behind that laughter were real cracks, Fran Drescher's story naturally pulls us back to where everything began. Not Hollywood, not the bright lights of sitcom fame, but a very real-life corner of New York, where a little girl grew up with tiny but stubborn insecurities and with a personality that hadn't even fully bloomed yet, before someone told her it needed to be fixed into the right shape. Fran Drescher was born on September 30th, 1957, in Queens, New York, a working-class neighborhood with no glamour, where people believed in discipline, in hard work, in living decently first before daring to dream. Her mother worked in sales. Her father was in the computer field. This wasn't the kind of family that manufactures a star through power connections or money. It was the kind that raises a child through steady routines, mornings to work, evenings back home, keeping order, and holding each other with a quiet, unspoken love. On the surface, Fran's childhood looked fairly ordinary. Movie outings, bowling nights, the simple joys shared by countless Queens kids. But underneath, that little girl carried a very real insecurity early on. Fran was overweight, and she always felt she had to diet, to adjust herself, to become smaller and neater in order to be accepted. That insecurity wasn't loud. It didn't turn her into a rebel. It simply made her more sensitive to other people's eyes, and it made her learn early how to shield herself with quick wit. As a child, that high-pitched, unmistakably New York voice wasn't seen as cute. Some adults bluntly treated it as a problem. A teacher even told her that if she wanted a serious path, she would need to get rid of that voice. For a child, a comment like that feels like a red stamp pressed onto identity itself. If you want approval, you must fix yourself first. Fran tried. She tried speaking slower, deeper, more pleasant, as if changing her tone could change her fate. But the more she forced herself into another version, the more breathless she became, because it felt like turning off the light inside her own room. By high school, that idea was no longer a daydream. Fran decided she would become an actress. She started studying drama, signing up for commercials, and surprisingly, real opportunities actually began knocking. But those first steps were filled with irony. She appeared in ads for Dad's Root Beer, then McDonald's. Yet the cruel twist was this: they let her appear, but they wouldn't let her say a single word. As if the one thing that made her truly different was the very thing she was required to hide. Fran once again tried to correct herself. She worked with a coach on what they called a low-slow flow, slower, deeper, softer, and she brought it into auditions. She remembered one audition for The Winds of War. Her manager was eager to hear how she sounded with that low, slow flow. And the casting director half joked, half seriously remarked that she spoke too slowly, even though it was an 18-hour miniseries. In that moment, Fran understood something with striking clarity. The more she tried to become a pleasant version, the more she erased what made her hers. She was a comic actress, and that mocked voice was her sweetest weapon. But what's most fascinating about Fran isn't just natural talent. It's the fearless queen's nerve, bold in a way other people wouldn't dare. At 15, Fran entered Miss Teenage New York with a very practical goal: to win and secure representation for advertising work. She only placed as runner-up, but instead of treating it like an ending, she did something completely Fran Drescher. She called talent agencies directly and said she had won first place, because in her mind, they would never know. And the terrifying part? It worked. She said it. And she was signed almost immediately. It was also at 15 that Fran met Peter, a relationship that began in high school and would stay with her for a long time afterward, in the truest sense of growing up together. From there, the Queen's girl began living the rhythm of someone chasing opportunity. She asked her father to teach her how to drive instead of paying tuition, then used that money to have professional headshots taken. She enrolled in beauty school, yet still regularly took a bus, then the subway, then another bus, just to race from audition to audition across Manhattan. Some days, she would travel all that way only to hear, "Not right for the role." But Fran carried a weapon bigger than that sharp New York voice: persistence. Those first tiny roles didn't turn Fran Drescher into a star overnight, but they taught her a hard lesson. In this business, you can have personality, energy, a voice no one can mistake, and still be treated like seasoning, something they sprinkle in for flavor, something they can replace without missing it. Fran hustled from one audition to the next, from one film to another pilot, always trying to prove she wasn't just a pretty comic actress with a funny New York voice. But the further she went, the clearer it became. If she kept waiting to be chosen, she would spend her whole life trapped inside a role other people kept assigning her. She started with the smallest things. One of Fran's earliest appearances on screen was as a guest, a dancer in Saturday Night Fever, 1978. A role too small to carry her name far, but big enough to say she had stepped into the very world she had been craving. By the 1980s, she was showing up more regularly in film and television, building her career inch by inch with a kind of presence audiences couldn't forget. If there was one role that proved Fran could stamp herself onto a story even without standing at the center, it was Bobby Fleckman, the razor-sharp publicist in This Is Spinal Tap, 1984. She didn't need much screen time. Fran still made people look. And yet the strange thing was, the more she worked, the more stuck she felt. Projects that went nowhere began repeating like a loop. She did a short-lived series, Princesses, then another pilot. Some of them never even aired. Each failure like that doesn't just exhaust you. It makes you doubt yourself. Maybe you're only meant to audition for the rest of your life. Fran wasn't built to endure that kind of waiting for long. She began trusting an instinct straight out of Queens. If there isn't a role that fits you, create it yourself. And then the most important stroke of fortune in her entire life arrived in the most ordinary way. No stage lights, no flashing cameras, no fairy tale destiny. It happened on a transatlantic flight in 1991, apt inside a role other people kept assigning her. That day, Fran was traveling alone when she suddenly spotted a face that nearly stopped her heart. Jeff Sagansky, the president of CBS. And what mattered was this: Jeff wasn't a stranger. He already knew Fran. He'd worked with her on Princesses and on another pilot that never made it to air. But seeing him in real life, inside the tight space of an airplane, hit differently. This wasn't a distant, abstract opportunity anymore. This was opportunity sitting right in front of her, and it would disappear the second the plane touched down. Fran later described that moment in her exact kind of voice. Funny, but razor-edged. She recognized him and, in her head, blurted out a prayer-like exclamation, "Thank you, Lord." And what she did next wasn't to sit still and act professional the way most people would. It was the opposite. It was very human. She ran straight into the airplane bathroom to touch up her makeup, as if reminding herself, this is not the moment to look sloppy. This is the moment to be ready. That detail alone tells you Fran's instinct. She didn't wait for luck to arrive looking perfect. She made herself ready, so luck couldn't ignore her. When she came back out, Jeff recognized her first. They exchanged a few polite lines. Jeff said he regretted the earlier project hadn't been picked up, then added more or less that CBS would find something else for her. For most people, that would have been enough. Nod, smile, let it end there. A lucky encounter. Done. But Fran wasn't most people. She looked straight at him and decided to push the door open right there, on the spot. She said something that, when you hear it later, sounds less like a request and more like a declaration. She wanted to pitch. She wanted to present her own idea. And she mentioned Peter Mark Jacobson, her husband at the time, the creative partner who understood her better than anyone. Fran told him the two of them knew her comedic brand, and CBS had to give them the chance to present it. Jeff looked slightly surprised, but Fran didn't back down. She didn't sabotage herself with lines like, "I'm sorry to bother you." In her head, there was only one cold, simple logic. He was a captive audience. Where was he going to go? Coach? That mix of humor and stubborn nerve made the moment come alive. It stopped being a coincidence and turned into a full-blown sales pitch at 30,000 feet. By the end of that 9-hour flight, Jeff told Fran that once she got back to Los Angeles, she should call his office. He would arrange a meeting with CBS's comedy development team so she could pitch her idea. And to Fran, that one appointment alone was enough to make all those years of failed pilots suddenly feel meaningful. Finally, she had reached a place ordinary actors never touch, the threshold where decisions are made. The only problem now was one question: pitch what? And the answer came, again, from a tiny everyday moment. Exactly the kind of moment Fran had always been brilliant at turning into comedy. While in London visiting Twiggy because Twiggy and her husband were busy, Fran often took their 12-year-old daughter out so the girl wouldn't be lonely. One day, the girl complained her new shoes were hurting her feet. Fran didn't want to ruin the outing, so she told her to step on the heel, to break them in. The girl asked innocently, "Won't that ruin them?" And Fran replied, "It's not ruining them. It's getting them used to it." That moment haunted Fran with a strange realization. This was a relationship dynamic that didn't match the moral model adults always preach. Grown-ups don't always sacrifice for kids. Sometimes they choose what's convenient for themselves first. And that slightly shameful truth was painfully funny. Fran called Peter and told him she thought she had an idea, a flipped version of The Sound of Music. But instead of Julie Andrews walking through the door, Fran would walk through it. Peter only needed to hear a little to get it immediately. They didn't have time to daydream because the CBS meeting was waiting. They started developing the concept into something sharp enough to pitch. And from that moment on, Fran was no longer someone chasing roles. She had stepped into a new position, someone proposing a world, someone who believed she was unique enough to write the rest of her own life. And true to what Queens had taught her since childhood, When a door cracks open, Fran doesn't stand there admiring it. She pushes it wide. What happened next wasn't a small step forward. It was an explosion. And that explosion had a name: the Nanny. For 6 seasons, Fran Drescher became Fran Fine, a bridal shop salesgirl who walks into the mansion of Maxwell Sheffield, a wealthy, widowed Broadway producer, and ends up as the unlikely nanny to his 3 children. On paper, it sounds like a predictable sitcom formula. But the Nanny never survived on plot. It survived on something stronger: identity. And the most important truth behind the success of this series is something people rarely remember. The Nanny wasn't a role handed to Fran. It was a role she wrote for herself, a character built out of the very things Hollywood once tried to erase from her. When she was young, Fran had been told bluntly, if she wanted a serious career, she had to lose that voice. But when The Nanny aired, that mocked voice became one of the most powerful weapons in mainstream television, an unmistakable sound that people recognized within 3 seconds. It became the show's audio logo: addictive, unforgettable, and the more you heard it, the more it stuck. A sitcom can be forgotten after a few years, but an audio logo can't. Fran Fine walked onto the screen like a modern Lucille Ball, funny, dazzling, and almost too real. She talked fast, moved fast, laughed fast, shattered every rule of upper-class etiquette, and then made the entire Sheffield household spin to her rhythm. That energy created what Harper's Bazaar described as timeless appeal. The Nanny wasn't just comedy, it was romance. It was Cinderella fantasy. It was a weekly fashion show, and later it became a vivid living portrait of the 1990s. And that's exactly why the series never feels old. Fran once said she didn't think The Nanny returning to streaming was about reintroducing it to younger audiences. Because in truth, the older audiences had already carried it through time. They grew up, became millennials, and some of them introduced it to their own children. In that way, The Nanny became something like an inherited memory, not just a show. Fran called it by the name it truly deserved: a classic. And classics never go out of style, but what turned The Nanny into a phenomenon wasn't only Fran and Mr. Sheffield. It was the way the series operated on multiple levels, like a gift wrapped in layers. Kids laughed because The Nanny was ridiculous and lovable. Adults caught what they understood better: the sexual tension that kept rising, then stopped at exactly the right moment. The double entendre clean enough for family viewing, yet sharp enough to make adults burst out laughing. And even bold gay humor slipped in as a natural language. No explanations, no permission asked. That feeling made The Nanny seem like a show that knew exactly what it was doing. It was smart, it was confident, and it wasn't afraid to shine. And then there was something else that made The Nanny outlive any ratings number: fashion. Fran Drescher admitted it directly. From the beginning, they understood television was a visual medium, and comedy was a form of escape. So everything had to be beautiful, vibrant, and better than real life. With stylist Brenda Cooper, Fran Fine's wardrobe became a feast for the eyes. Moschino, Donna Karan, Todd Oldham, Paco Rabanne. Leopard prints turned into a signature motif, and even the simple act of walking down that curved staircase looked like a runway moment. Fran once shared a behind-the-scenes detail that became unforgettable: the first time her character wore a satin robe down to breakfast. The network objected. It was unrealistic. And the show's response was practically its manifesto: "Exactly. That's the show, honey. Fran is a glamorous girl from Flushing. She doesn't behave like a Sheffield woman on Park Avenue." It sounded like a joke, but it was the truth. The Nanny succeeded because it never asked permission to be realistic. It was born to be fun, to be beautiful, and to let viewers escape real life for a while. In the years that followed, the series didn't disappear. It simply changed the way it existed. When streaming opened the door, the Nanny surged back like a revival wave, not only because of nostalgia, but because the short clip era suddenly discovered something. Fran Fine was a character made to go viral. Outfits became videos, lines became memes, and young people, some not even born when the show first aired, fell for it like it was a brand new culture. Fran remembered the peak years through details that were ordinary, but painfully real. She did talk shows like Jay Leno and Conan O'Brien. Outside the mainstream, LGBTQ+ bars hosted the Nanny screenings. At festivals like Wigstock and Pride, people dressed up as Fran Fine. They didn't just see her as a character, they saw her as an icon. And then, right when everything looked like it was nothing but bright lights, the story quietly turned in another direction. Something softer, something more painful. Because behind the glittering sitcom, there was a truth Fran could hardly escape. As The Nanny approached its ending, real life was also inching toward a major turning point, inside the very marriage that had helped create the show in the first place. But that is the part Fran would have to answer in the next chapter, where laughter was no longer enough to cover every crack. After The Nanny, Fran Drescher stepped into that hazy zone where so many sitcom stars get trapped. You've just created an icon, and from that moment on, everything you do is judged through one cold, relentless question. Can you outgrow the shadow of Fran Fine? Television changed. Audience taste changed. And Hollywood changed too, less gently than people like to admit. They no longer needed another Fran Drescher. They only wanted Fran Drescher in 1993. But Fran wasn't built on nostalgia. She understood that if she tried to recreate the old magic, what she'd get in return would only be a faded version of herself. So the years that followed became a phase where Fran kept working steadily, still appearing on television, still doing cameos, still maintaining her presence, but with one underlying feeling. She was searching for a new anchor, a role that wouldn't always be measured under the giant shadow of The Nanny. In 2005, she tried returning to sitcom territory with Living with Fran. It proved she still had the charm, still controlled comedic rhythm, still had that rare ability to turn dialogue into a signature. But the era was different now. Major network sitcoms were no longer the easy explosion stage they had been in the 90s, and audiences no longer looked at Fran as a fresh surprise. They looked at her like a legend, and sometimes being a legend makes it harder to move forward. And then Fran chose a very unusual direction, not trying to create another character that would make audiences forget Fran Fine, but doing the opposite, using her real life to write a brand new sitcom. That's how Happily Divorced was born in 2011. If The Nanny was a Queens-flavored Cinderella fairy tale, a girl walking into an upper-class world and forcing an entire wealthy household to spin to the rhythm of her laughter, then Happily Divorced was adult comedy, where illusions are gone, and only truth remains. And truth can be both funny and painful at the same time. The most valuable part of Happily Divorced wasn't the divorce situation. It was the paradox underneath it. A woman who gets divorced but still has to live with her ex-husband. And the real shock is, the ex-husband comes out. For the media, that was tabloid fuel. But for Fran, it was something else entirely. A story about how you can love someone so deeply, see them as your soulmate, your family, the greatest companion of your life, and still have to accept that the two of you do not belong to the same kind of life. And what set Fran apart from so many in Hollywood was that she didn't tell this story with bitterness. She didn't turn it into scandal. She turned it into an emotional laboratory, laughing and aching at once, tender and ridiculous in the most everyday way. Yet the longer you watch, the more you feel something genuinely grown up underneath it. Something the viewers who grew up with The Nanny were finally old enough to understand. The title Happily Divorced sounds like a joke, but it's also a Fran Drescher manifesto. Don't turn heartbreak into hatred, don't turn wounds into identity, and don't allow life to end in a period. That's why the sitcom carries such a strange pull. It isn't just there to make you laugh. It's the kind of laughter with scratches on it. Laughing because it's too accurate. Laughing because you've been there too. Laughing because you're watching a woman walk through failure without self-destruction. Career-wise, it was almost Fran's second peak after The Nanny, not in the sense of a nationwide blockbuster, but in a more important sense. She reclaimed the right to tell her own story. The series ran for 2 seasons, 2011-2013, on TV Land, a solid achievement for cable television, strong enough to prove that Fran could still stand at the center of a sitcom, carry it, and, more importantly, make audiences love her in a new way, not just as nostalgia for Fran Fine. But Fran didn't stop there. What's interesting is that after fully inhabiting a sitcom about happy divorce, she stepped into another kind of success, quieter yet deeply rooted in pop culture. Voice acting for the Hotel Transylvania franchise. It was a smart kind of revival. Fran didn't need to stay constantly in front of the camera. She only needed the very weapon people once mocked when she was a child, her voice. And that same voice carried her into a new generation of audiences, a completely different audience life. Children, families, Gen Z, without anyone needing to reintroduce her. Then came Broadway, when she appeared in Cinderella in 2014, another kind of milestone, not loud, but seriously weighty. And in recent years, she continued taking television projects like Indebted in 2020. It was short-lived, yes, but enough to show that Fran Drescher never truly disappeared. She simply shifted into a different kind of existence, less illusion, less need to prove herself, but with the same core intact. A woman who refuses to be boxed in. After everything, Fran's post. The Nanny story isn't really about finding the peak again. It's something rarer, a sitcom star who survived her own legend, then created a new peak using the very thing people assumed would break her private life. And if The Nanny made the world laugh because Fran was so wildly different, Happily Divorced made people stay because Fran was simply too real. With The Nanny, audiences saw Fran Drescher as a woman who always had laughter waiting in her throat, a radiant face, a voice everyone recognized instantly, a presence that made it seem like life was nothing but an endless chain of punchlines. But at the very moment that image was becoming a television symbol, her real life moved in the opposite direction, quietly, complicatedly, and with blows so heavy no sitcom would ever have the nerve to turn them into a script. The person who stayed with Fran the longest wasn't a famous director or a glamorous co-star. It was Peter Mark Jacobson, the boy she met when they were both 15 in high school. They didn't just date in the innocent teenage way. They truly grew up together inside the same atmosphere, joining drama programs, rehearsing, dreaming. But they also did the unglamorous things people forget when they tell a pretty love story. Directing, lighting, backstage work, doing everything like a tiny team trying to build something out of nothing. After school, they would go home and sit in front of the TV like two kids who only knew how to dream of a different life. So much so that Fran's mother once looked at them and briefly thought, "Oh, God, what is this boy going to do for a living someday?" A question so ordinary, so Queens, and also so accurate for that moment. Two children choosing art the way people choose a gamble. But that gamble lasted longer than anyone imagined. They stayed together through their teenage years in Queens, carried the shared dream of escaping the quiet predictability of Flushing, studied together, entered the industry side by side, and then married when they were only 21, in 1978. It was the kind of proper choice their neighborhood understood. Marry young, have a respectable wedding, and believe in happily ever after. Peter later admitted that those standards were exactly what made him bury feelings he couldn't name. Moments of attraction to men, followed by the pressure to force himself into the life everyone around him was living. For many years, Peter wasn't just a husband, he was her teammate, the person who helped build her career from behind the scenes. They worked together, grew together, and eventually created the Nanny together, their most important shared child. Under the lights, Fran was the funny woman making America laugh. But beyond the lights, their marriage held a rare kind of attachment. Not just love, but the deep habit of having each other every single day, so much that without it, life itself seemed to lose its weight. That's why the shock that came later was something far harder to name. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't the kind of affair the press loves. It was a quiet truth that had lived underneath their marriage for years. Peter, slowly realizing he didn't belong to the traditional world he'd forced himself to inhabit. For a time, he confessed to Fran that he thought he might be bisexual, and at the same time said something that left Fran both moved and trapped. He loved her. He loved the life they had, and he wanted to stay with her forever. Fran, always confident, always used to holding it together as if she could handle anything, received that confession as proof of love. She didn't want to punish him for honesty. She thought, "My God, he trusts me enough to say it, and maybe he loves me that much." But the most painful part of this story is that Fran didn't discover the truth in a scandalous explosion. She learned it through erosion. When a man suppresses his real instincts for too long, what leaks out isn't only secrecy, it's emotion. Peter became angry, controlling, insecure, and Fran began to feel as if she was living inside a box she couldn't even explain. She didn't know when it had been locked, only that she could no longer breathe inside it. Later, when she spoke about that period, Fran used an image that lingered like a bruise. She felt like a bird in a golden cage, not deprived, not miserable on the outside, but unable to breathe. They tried. They didn't want to let go. They dragged time out. The way people drag out something too beautiful to accept is breaking. But the harder Fran tried to hold it, the more she realized she was trapped in a role that no longer fit. And this is the core tragedy. Sometimes what kills a marriage isn't that love disappears. Sometimes it's that people realize they've been loving the wrong shape of life. In the end, it was Fran who ended it. A decision Peter couldn't survive emotionally. He begged her to stay. She still left. And just when everything seemed beyond saving, the most cruel coincidence arrived. The Nanny ended. Peter left Los Angeles and moved to New York, and they didn't speak for an entire year. A silence so long it felt like cutting away a whole section of life. But Fran's marriage wasn't only tested by Peter's truth. Even before he came out, their lives had already been broken by an event so chilling that hearing it once is enough to make your blood run cold. The violent home invasion in 1985, inside their own home in Los Angeles. It was an evening that began completely ordinary. Fran and Peter were home, a friend was visiting, they ate dinner like any married couple. Then two armed men broke in. No warning, no time to react. Everything unfolded like a nightmare. All three were restrained and tied up. The house was torn apart. And in that moment, the most merciless thing happened. Something that can't be described with the word robbery anymore. Fran and her friend were raped at gunpoint. Peter was bound and helpless, forced to watch. Not in a dark alley, not on an empty street, but inside the very home they had believed was the safest place in the world. Those men didn't only steal possessions, they stole safety. They stole the intactness of a life and left behind something heavier than any visible wound: trauma. Fran and Peter survived, but no one truly escapes something like that. You can keep breathing, keep working, keep smiling, but from that moment on, the inside of your life is marked. And what matters is this: they stayed silent for years, as if not speaking of it could make it disappear. But what is buried too deep never disappears. It only turns into a long shadow, lying beneath both a marriage and even the body itself. The most haunting detail is that they kept quiet for years. Not because it was small, but because some pain, once spoken, becomes a memory that replays every day. That silence mirrored the way Fran kept working, kept laughing, kept showing up in public as if she was fine. But the price of trauma always arrives late. It seeps into marriage. It seeps into the sense of safety. It seeps into the way a person looks at the world. And it creates a lasting darkness. A darkness that made a marriage already full of cracks even more fragile. When Fran stepped out of that marriage, she thought she had reached rock bottom. But no, life still had another blow waiting. One more brutal because it landed at the exact moment she was trying to stand up again. Her body began sending strange signals, dragging her through one medical test after another. And still, no answers. That kind of uncertainty is more exhausting than a bad diagnosis, because you don't know what you're fighting, and you don't know how to keep living in that half-sick, half-normal state. Eventually, the truth surfaced: uterine cancer. In 2000, Fran was diagnosed, a piece of news that arrived like a sentence, especially since she was only in her early 40s and didn't fit the typical category people are warned about. Even more bitter was the quiet loss that women often only dare to speak about when they're alone. She had to undergo surgery that meant she could never have children. For Fran, a woman who never gave birth, that was a particularly bitter pill, because it didn't just take her health. It took away a choice she hadn't even had the chance to fully make. And the cruelest paradox was this: that very illness became the thread that pulled two people back toward each other after a full year of silence. Peter later said he received a call from Fran's manager telling him she had cancer, and in that moment, all the broken anger collapsed. Not because every mistake disappeared, but because he suddenly understood how short life is, too short to waste even one more minute on hatred. And Fran, after coming face to face with death, also began seeing everything in a new order. What mattered was no longer who was right or wrong in a marriage that had ended, but in what way they could still love each other. That's why they became something rare. No longer husband and wife, but still family. And when Jacobson fully acknowledged that he was gay after the divorce, Fran was the one who received it with a strange sense of relief. She didn't want him trapped anymore. She only wanted him to be happy, just as she, after everything, wanted to live honestly with herself. They even managed to turn that chapter into art again when they created Happily Divorced, the story of a woman whose husband comes out after 18 years of marriage. For Fran, telling it wasn't just making a sitcom. It was a release, a way to stare directly at the past and understand how much she had grown. And something strange happened. In what should have been her most crushing period, Fran revealed her real essence, not the funny nanny, but a woman with an almost ferocious survival instinct. She didn't turn herself into a long-term victim. She turned tragedy into purpose. She went through treatment, survived, and came out with an attitude that makes people feel both tenderness and respect. If life had taken too much from her, then she would take back the right to tell her own story. Even when Fran entered her second marriage, to Shiva Ayyadurai in 2014, Peter was still present as a special kind of love in her life. Not to interfere, but to prove that some relationships don't disappear after divorce. Peter even wrote Fran a letter, saying she had taught him how to love someone, and that all he wanted was for her to be happy. But that second marriage, in the end, did not become a harbor either. It lasted only a short time before ending, as if Fran entered it with the hope of a woman who had already had too much taken from her, yet walked away with the clarity of someone who knew she could not survive one more lifetime of trying to make it work. No noise, no cheap drama. Just a marriage that came and went, leaving behind a truth clearer than ever. Fran did not lack the ability to love. She simply no longer wanted to trade her peace to preserve a form called marriage. And that is also why Fran's private life, though full of cuts, does not end in darkness. It ends in something deeply Fran Drescher. Still painful, still honest, but not broken. Because she was the woman who once used laughter to cover her wounds. And then one day, she no longer needed to cover them. She learned to live with them, as proof that she survived. Fran Drescher leaves behind a very particular legacy. Not the kind of legend carved out of awards, but the kind of imprint that survives because of collective memory. People can forget a filmography list, forget nominations, forget ratings numbers. But it is very hard to forget Fran Fine, and even harder to forget that voice. What was once criticized as not serious, not proper, ultimately became the audio logo of an entire generation. You only need a few seconds to know it's her. And once you recognize it, you can't unhear it. That's why The Nanny is not just a successful 1990s sitcom. It is a pop culture blueprint. A female character who is loud yet intelligent, clumsy yet proud. Someone who can walk into a rich household like Cinderella and still never lose her queen's roots. Fran Fine wasn't given a magic spell to become elegant. She dragged her working-class, unapologetic self into the upper-class world and forced that world to learn how to live with it. That is exactly why younger audiences, even those who weren't even born when the show first aired, are still obsessed, because the character isn't outdated. She carries a kind of timeless energy, real, fast, and never asking permission to exist. Fran's second legacy is something fewer people say out loud. She turned comedy into a form of self-defense. In an industry that loves placing women into safe, acceptable molds, Fran turned flaws into a brand, turned difference into leverage, and turned herself into the one controlling the narrative. The Nanny wasn't a role she was handed. It was a role Fran wrote for herself. In Hollywood terms, that isn't just success. That's soft power, a kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself, yet still forces the entire system to adjust to your existence. And over time, that legacy didn't stay on screen. Fran Drescher became a rare symbol of the female survivor artist, not someone who survived because life was kind, but someone who survived because she could get back up and redefine herself. From her cancer story to the founding of Cancer Schmancer, from personal pain to turning it into a public voice, Fran did what many celebrities avoid. She brought the unpretty parts of her life into the light, but not to beg for pity. She told it like someone who owned it. And when she became president of SAG-AFTRA, Fran left yet another mark. She proved that a woman once dismissed as too funny, too weird, could still become the head of one of Hollywood's most powerful institutions, without changing her voice, changing her style, or performing masculine energy to be taken seriously. In other words, Fran isn't only a sitcom icon. She is a living model of this truth. Being different is not something you must fix. Being different can be exactly what makes the world remember you. So if we had to compress Fran Drescher's legacy into one sentence, it wouldn't be a poetic line. It would simply be a truth that's uncomfortable and beautiful at the same time. She didn't win because life went easy on her. She won because she refused to disappear. At an age when many 90s sitcom stars have either faded from public memory or only reappear in nostalgic clips, Fran Drescher exists in a different way. Not loud, not chasing a comeback, but absolutely refusing to turn herself into a memory. She lives between two worlds, one part still Fran fine in the audience's eyes, the other part a woman who has long learned how to design her own life without waiting for anyone to write it for her. For some years, Fran nearly stepped away from the steady rhythm of television work. But that wasn't a sign of decline. It felt like a deliberate choice. She gave time to her health, to community activism, to projects that actually meant something to her. Fran's later acting career hasn't been driven by the number of roles, but by instinct, choosing what still makes her feel alive. In 2025, she joined A24's Marty Supreme, playing the mother of the character portrayed by Timothée Chalamet. A choice that shows Fran is still invited into major arenas where people want personality, not convenience. At the same time, she returned in Spinal Tap 2, stepping back into the role of Bobby Fleckman, a wink to an earlier legacy, yet never a desperate grip on the past. More like an artist returning to the exact place where her essence once sharpened into something unforgettable. What's even more striking is that 2025 also marked a clear turning point in Fran's public life. She closed her leadership journey at SAG-AFTRA decisively, confirming she would not run for another term. Not because she was tired, but because she chose to end at the right moment. As someone who understands real power is knowing when to stop. And then, on September 30th, 2025, her birthday, Fran received her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. That moment wasn't just an honor for a television character. It was Hollywood finally admitting what it once doubted. The voice they mocked, the difference they once wanted her to fix, had become something irreplaceable. Peter Mark Jacobson is still present in her life as a kind of family. No paperwork required. They may have walked through rupture, silence, and pain, but in the end, they found another form of attachment. Less illusion, but more truth. Fran once said, in the most down-to-earth way, that sometimes people don't need to be husband and wife to stay connected for life. And watching them, audiences understand that line isn't philosophy. It's lived experience. That's also why the fact that they continue dreaming up new directions for the Nanny, like bringing it to the stage, doesn't feel like reheating a brand. It feels like two people who once built a shared dream, now learning how to preserve the most beautiful part of it without returning to who they used to be. What stands out most about Fran today is this. She no longer lives to prove anything. She doesn't need to prove she's strong because she has been fragile and didn't die from it. She doesn't need to prove she's successful because the Nanny did that long ago. What Fran is doing now is simpler and harder, living as herself, without shame, without running, without permission. And perhaps that's exactly why, even as time passes, Fran never feels old. People don't follow her only for nostalgia. They follow her because she still holds something rare in Hollywood. Honesty, in the instinctive sense. What is truly hers, she keeps. What isn't, she lets go. Her story isn't just the journey of a successful star. It's also the journey of a woman who has been forced to begin again many times. And each time, she chose the harder way. Freer, truer, with fewer illusions. In Fran, people see a kind of strength Hollywood rarely produces. Not the strength of spotlight, but the strength of someone who dares to hold on to her identity even when life tries to strip everything away. Fran Drescher didn't become an icon simply because she was funny. She became an icon because she survived without losing her voice. And if today it still takes only a few seconds to recognize that voice in an old clip, maybe it isn't just because Fran Fine was lovable. Maybe it's because behind Fran Fine, there was a real Fran Drescher, a woman who turned what was once mocked, once wounded, once crushed, into the very thing the world could never forget. Do you still watch The Nanny? And for you, is Fran Fine just a comedy character? Or the way Fran Drescher saved herself? Leave a comment below. And if you want me to keep telling stories like this, glory and darkness, laughter and the price behind it, hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes.